All right, everybody, we are now back with part two for this lecture on tissues. So we already covered epithelial tissue. Now we're going to go ahead and get into connective tissue. So connective tissue is found basically everywhere. Part of that is because it's the most diverse tissue type. So you'll see connective tissue has a very broad spectrum of different tissue types. And so it has a very broad spectrum of functions, and really the different functions we can kind of connect to specific types of connective tissue. And because they're so different, a lot of these functions don't necessarily overlap. So I would think more of your functions with each tissue that you'll see on your slides going forward. But remember, these all as a whole fall under the umbrella of connective tissue. And so, one of the things that almost all connective tissues do in some way or another is enclose an organ or separate organs into different layers. And of course, a lot of them are going to help connect tissues to one another. A great example of this are tendons, which connect our muscle to bone, and ligaments, which connect our bone to bone. Support and movement is going to be primarily our bone tissue. And so that is a hardened connective tissue that we'll see is a little different than some of the others. Fat, or we also could call that adipose tissue, is there for storage. So storage in terms of energy, and fat's also how we can transport some molecules in the body. Fat also provides some cushioning and insulation. So our brains are behind our skull, our heart and lungs are behind the rib cage, but we have a lot of other abdominal organs that need protection, and fat is a part of that. Blood is our only liquid connective tissue, and its job is transportation. That's how we get everything throughout the body to different places. And then protection is one that's a little less intuitive, but all of our blood cells come from the bone marrow. That's going to include our white blood cells, which we associate most with the immune system. And then protection from the standpoint, what we just mentioned, we got our brain behind a thick skull, our heart and lungs behind a rib cage. So we put our important things in a safe spot. All right, so compared to epithelial tissue, we're going to see overall less actual cells and a lot more extracellular matrix. And extracellular means outside of the cell. And this matrix is really going to be a fluid substance that's also going to contain proteins and fibers. So the ground substance tends to be the fluid and the other ions, nutrients dissolved within that fluid. We're going to have different types of proteins that are going to give our tissues different characteristics. Same thing, different types of fibers are going to give each tissue a different characteristic. Okay, so we can kind of have three broad categories of connective tissue. We have loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, and then we have a third category, which is our specialized connective tissue. So we'll start with loose, and the first one is areolar. So it falls into the loose category because you can see here, we don't necessarily have extracellular matrix and fibers and cells all over the place. It's quite a loose arrangement of fibers. You can see the light shining through our slide here because there's a lot of space. And then you can see where we have the nuclei of our cells that are pretty spaced out here. They're not one on top of the other. And I always think of areolar tissue like tissue paper or packing peanuts. It's our loose packing, and it's going to kind of fill areas that are empty and need some cushioning or some extra support. Another thing with areolar tissue is our connective tissue, remember, is very vascular. So sometimes areolar tissue is going to provide nourishment for some of the structures surrounding it. We find this in a lot of places, and the basement membranes actually rest on areolar tissue. So we talked about basement membrane in the epithelial chapter. Remember, epithelial tissue is avascular. It does not have a good blood supply. So it's relying on the nutrients in the areolar connective tissue underlying to provide that to our epithelial cells. All right, our other loose connective tissue is adipose tissue. And so you can see our slide down here, we have a lot of adipocytes, and they're mostly completely filled with fat. You can kind of see the corner of the nucleus here, but all the white is just fat filling that cell, and it's pushed all the organelles to the very borders of these cells. And so again, it's a packing material, so we can fill space with it. It insulates, so it helps us maintain heat. It does serve as energy depending on what we are doing, and then it's going to protect a lot of our organs. All right, moving on to our dense connective tissue and just looking at our microscopic slides here, you can already see a pretty big difference. We see these tighter packed, a lot more nuclei, and not as much light shining through. There's very minimal space. And so our dense connective tissues are going to have a lot of collagen. And so collagen is one of our fibers that gives our tissues a lot of strength. And you can see these are all running in the same direction, and our ligaments and tendons almost organize like a rope or a string. So there's very little ground substance or fluid here. Compared to our loose connective tissue, we have a lot more cells that are much tighter packed. And so they're tighter packed like this, and they're all running the same direction because ligaments and tendons are getting pulled on by our muscles and bones all the time. And so they need to withstand the force of that movement. And just try not to mix them up. Ligaments attach bones to bones, tendons attach muscle to bone. And one other thing that's more of a nice to know, definitely not a need to know, ligaments and joints are what we can sprain. So with a P, you can sprain a ligament. Tendons and muscles, you strain with a T. So I think when you're trying to use a lot of muscle, think about you're straining your body. That's how I always have remembered it. So ligaments we sprain, tendons we strain. So like I said, not being tested on that, but just a nice to know. All right, our next tissue type is cartilage, and we'll talk about the characteristics of these three different types. When it comes to our labs, it's very difficult to distinguish our three different types of cartilage. So we really just need to know cartilage as a overarching group. But for our lecture test, you do need to know the individual characteristics for each type. One thing that we can look at on the microscope that's a bit characteristic of cartilage and bone as well are that our cells, our sites, these are our mature cells that are maintaining that tissue, are found in these little pockets called lacunae. And so I'll show you that on our next slide. Our ground substance in cartilage is going to also contain proteoglycans and hyaluronic acid. And so what those do are trap water. So they're trying to keep that tissue hydrated, and that allows it to spring back so it's good or strong against compression. And it also gives it a bit of a firm consistency so it doesn't have too much give. So an example of cartilage in the body would be the menisci of the knee, two discs in each knee. And so think we have our whole body weight compressing those every single step. So it needs to be able to spring back kind of once we get back off it. We don't want it to start getting crushed or depressed. Here's this word avascular again. So remember that means without a blood supply, and it also doesn't have a good nerve supply. And what this really means to us from a clinical standpoint is that cartilage is going to heal very slowly. Sometimes if there's damage enough to cartilage where there's not good enough blood supply or tissue underneath that can supply enough nutrients, cartilage won't heal at all, and sometimes they'll just have to take it out rather than actually trying to repair it or letting it heal. So we're going to talk about three different types: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Okay, the first one is hyaline cartilage, and I think this is what most people think of when we say cartilage, or especially if any of you guys have parents or grandparents that have arthritis and say their knees hurt and they're bone on bone. This is what they're talking about being gone, is that their hyaline cartilage has worn down. So we find it on the ends of our long bones. It's somewhat transparent, so you can see even though there's substance here, we can see a lot of light through it still. And this is really what you want to look for on a microscopic perspective is these chondrocytes in their lacunae. So these pockets where our mature cartilage cells, our chondrocytes are contained, are found in all our different types of cartilage. And so the big one to remember is the articular surface of our bones. The nose is also made of hyaline cartilage. And then we'll talk more in our skeletal chapter about how our skeleton actually forms from cartilage initially. So kind of keep that one in the back of your mind. All right, our elastic cartilage is going to have a similar consistency and look to hyaline cartilage. The big difference, no surprise, it has a higher percentage of elastic fibers. So a great example of this is our earlobe. You can tug all over your earlobe and it's going to go right back to the shape it already was. So it's a little more flexible than our hyaline cartilage because of those elastic fibers. So you can see those right there in our matrix. And again, we have the chondrocytes located in their lacunae. So the earlobes is the best example. Your epiglottis is also an example of this. Okay, our last one, fibrocartilage. This is our strongest cartilage, and so you kind of see the theme. Depending on the type of fiber it has is going to determine its function. So it's got a lot more collagen because that's our strength fiber. So elastin gives us a lot of stretch, collagen gives us a lot of strength. And these are organized almost more like we saw with our dense connective tissue. So we see not necessarily more chondrocytes themselves. You can see them here in their lacunae again, but the fibers are much denser and they're a lot closer packed together. You see much less light and fluid. And so another example of this would be our intervertebral discs. So think just like we talked about the menisci in our knees, we have the weight of our spine, or really our whole weight on our spine, and we have intervertebral discs made of fibrocartilage in between each individual vertebrae to help absorb that shock. Even think when you jump and you land, your knees and your spine have to be able to absorb that shock. Another example of this would be the pubic symphysis. So your pelvis really is two halves that meet in the middle. And so we have a piece of fibrocartilage in between the two halves of the pelvis that forms the joint in the front. All right, bone is one of our specialized connective tissues, and it's specialized because its extracellular matrix is hardened. It has a really, really good blood supply. Again, we see this word lacunae, and so those are the holes or the spots where our mature bone cells are living. In this case, the matrix is going to give a lot of strength and rigidity because it's hardened. So this is going to be collagen fibers again, providing some of that strength. And then calcium and phosphate, a combination that we know as hydroxyapatite, is what really gives it the hardened structure. And so we can kind of subdivide bone into two different types. So we'll talk about compact bone and spongy bone. So I want you to pay attention because there's differences in how these are organized, and there's also differences in where we find our different types of bone. Our first one is compact bone. And if you've had your tissues lab already, this is what we looked at when we looked at a slice of compact bone. So it organizes into these rings. And so these circles are called lamellae. So that's how our matrix organizes. The central canal allows for blood flow, as well as nerve supply, and basically a way for things to get in and out of the bone there. Each central canal also has a lot of smaller branching canals that come off of it to get to the adjacent lacunae, basically a way to connect all of our different osteocytes together. We call the functional unit of our compact bone an osteon, Osteon. So a whole group of these organized into lamellae, we would call an osteon. So one bone cell is an osteocyte, but kind of our functional unit, we can call it for compact bone, would be considered an osteon. And so it has these central canals in the middle of the osteon, these rings we call lamellae. And then I will point out sometimes you'll see rather than it called the smaller canal, they're really called haversion canals that connect our lacunae. Haversion, Haversion. And so the main one to remember is it's going to be the outer portion of pretty much all of our bones. And we'll talk about long bones the most in our skeletal lecture when we talk about bone formation. And we find this in the shaft of a long bone. The technical term for that would be the diaphysis. So the diaphysis of long bones are made of compact bone. Okay, our next one is spongy bone. And so rather than being as compact, this has more of a spongy structure. There's more space. So if you've seen lattice on a deck, that kind of diagonal square looking shape that encloses areas, this is kind of what spongy bone looks like. It's kind of a whole bunch of what we call trabeculae that have spaces between them. This word hemopoietic means it's blood producing. So this is where our blood cells are going to be made primarily. And so we still have osteocytes. So the actual type of cell doesn't change. It's really more the organization. So this still provides us some strength, but because we have a lot more space between our trabeculae compared to those lamellae and osteons, we're going to have a lot less weight in a spongy bone. And so our interior of our skull bones, the interior of our vertebrae, our spine, our sternum, and our pelvis are mostly spongy bone. And that's where a lot of our blood cells are being made throughout our lives. They're also found on the ends of our long bones. So we just said the compact bone is in the diaphysis, which is the shaft. For spongy bone, we have them in the epiphysis, which are the ends, the epiphyses, if I'm saying it plural. So I'm going to go back for just a second. So compact bone, we had a harder matrix. That's same for spongy, but we're organized into lamellae around a central canal. And so this whole unit together we would call an osteon. And then we have haversion canals that are going to connect our adjacent lacunae where all of our osteocytes are living. Spongy bone organizes into trabeculae, not lamellae. We're going to have a lot more space. That space is mostly going to have bone marrow because that's where our hemopoietic tissue is. That's where we make our blood cells, is the bone marrow. And we still have lacunae in the trabeculae. And then remember, for spongy bone, these are on the ends of our long bones. So those are the epiphyses. The compact bone is found in the shaft. That's the diaphysis. And we'll look at that again in our skeletal lecture. All right, the big thing to remember is that blood is in connective tissue. Because it's liquid, it kind of seems like it's on its own, but really it still falls into connective tissue. And of course, it has a fluid matrix. That's what allows it to flow through the body. And so it really doesn't have fibers. And we don't find collagen and elastin as much in the blood itself. We have three different types of cells. We have our red blood cells, which are responsible for transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have our white blood cells, which are our immune cells. And then we have our platelets, which are responsible for hemostasis, which is the fancy term for clotting and stopping bleeding. The big thing is transport, and that goes for multiple things. So, of course, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients like glucose, hormones, different wastes, pretty much everything goes through the bloodstream that's getting transported elsewhere. So because of our white blood cells, it helps to protect us from infection. And then we talked a little bit already about how our blood helps us with temperature regulation. So we can dilate, which means to widen, or we can constrict or narrow our blood vessels on the surface of our skin to allow temperature to either dissipate into the external environment, or we can try to prevent that heat loss. So we'll talk about that in our next chapter, the integumentary system. And of course, we find blood in our blood vessels, just to be clear. Those would be our arteries. So arteries carry away, veins carry blood back to the heart, and then our capillaries are kind of our intermediaries. Those are our really thin vessels where we actually exchange a lot of the nutrients and gases with our tissues. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cut it here again since that was one of our bigger chunks, and then come on back for part three. We'll talk about both muscle and nervous tissue. We'll finish up on that third part.